Good evening, and welcome to this year's Chris and John Furedy lecture. This is the first annual Chris and John Furedy lecture. I hope we'll have the Furedy lecture far into the future. Sponsored by the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, SAFS. My name is Mark Mercer, and I'm president of SAFS. Our organization is dedicated to academic freedom, freedom of expression on campus, high standards of scholarship. We stand opposed to the misuse of teaching. We think that academic decisions should be made on academic criteria alone. And some of the things we do to get our message out is to have public fora, talks, discussion groups, occasional debates. And that's the idea behind the Furedy lecture. Chris and John are original members of SAFS back in the early 90s when it was formed. John, unfortunately, is dead. Chris is in Australia, or New Zealand, Australia, yeah. And so she can't be here with us tonight. She's in Australia. But Chris and John were stalwarts of the organization and have helped us out in many, many ways. And we thought it fitting to honor them by naming this yearly lecture after them, a lecture on the contemporary university. And Rachel Fulton Brown will be our first Furedy lecturer. And we're looking forward to hearing from her. I want to introduce Andrew Lawton. Andrew will then introduce Rachel. Andrew is a local raconteur, media personality. I suspect most people in this room have heard of Andrew, if they haven't actually met him. I suppose most people in the room have actually met you. Yes. Anyway, Andrew Lawton.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark asked me, oh yeah, I forgot it doesn't amplify. Mark asked me earlier how I wanted to be introduced, and I just said positively, and he exceeded expectations, so thank you very much for that, Mark, and thank you for everyone for coming out. It's an event that excited me, not just because it was in London, but because of the title of it, Safe Spaces versus Sacred Spaces, and there's nothing more triggering than doing that 100 meters from CBC London, which they'll fill you in later, Rachel, okay. You don't want to know. Prov de North, I think is what they call it. But, it's actually tremendous. A year ago I was at the SAFS conference and life has changed a fair bit. Actually, it hasn't. A year ago I wasn't a member of provincial parliament and I'm still not. So I guess that didn't change. But there was an attempt at it. But you know what? It's so tremendous. I want to, first off, take a moment to acknowledge that we're in the territory of the Law Society of Ontario takeover. Thanks to two people in this room. Lisa, can you stand up? And Bruce, can you stand up? So these are the people. They have orchestrated a return to free speech and free principles in the law profession in Ontario, which is so tremendous because you don't need to worry about getting prosecuted now for anything that happens in Canada, Rachel. So thank you. It's going to be a great event. We have three amazing things that have come out of Chicago. The University of Chicago Principles of Free Expression, Garrett's Popcorn, and Rachel Fulton Brown. I won't rank which ones I love more, but I will say that you're in for a treat. Pardon me? Yes, Milton Friedman as well, who also liked Garrett's Popcorn, I believe. But you know what? The values that we're talking about as individuals and groups at SAFS routinely are values that we need to uphold in campus and off campus. And I was very pleased to be a part of this event when Mark specifically said he wanted to have an event that didn't just cater to, not that there's anything wrong with the academics, but the academics that are already on side with this. So it's a delight to see people from inside and outside the academy here. And we'll turn it on to our keynote speaker, the history professor from the University of Chicago, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm here this evening to give a report from the front of the culture wars in academia. I would like to share a few stories with you about my own experiences, as well as give some reflections on what we in academia are doing wrong, particularly in creating the kind of space that we should for our students. My argument will be that worrying about keeping them safe is not just wrong, but dangerous, precisely because it leaves them helpless. What we should be doing is training them for the greatest battle they will ever face as human beings, the battle for virtue and vice in their souls. But to get there, I need to tell you a little bit about myself and the battles I've been in, starting with the battle at my own institution over what kinds of space make students safe. As I'm sure many of you are aware, 3 years ago in September 2016, John Ellison, the Dean of Students in the college at the University of Chicago, sent a letter to our incoming class of 2020 in which he describes some of the things that they should expect and not expect to encounter as students in the college. One of the University of Chicago's defining characteristics, he told them, is our commitment to freedom of inquiry and expression. Members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn without fear of censorship. Civility and mutual respect are vital to all of us, and freedom of expression does not mean the freedom to harass or threaten others. You will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion, and even disagreement. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort, end quote. Not arguably all that remarkable a claim, you might think. Of course, our students should expect to feel challenged, perhaps even uncomfortable at times. They have been admitted to one of the top universities in the country. The university where, as it says on all the t-shirts, fun comes to die. But there was more. Quote, our commitment to academic freedom, Dean Ellison went on, means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own, end quote. The response from the nation at large, who knew so many were paying attention to us, was sharp and swift, none sharper and swifter, at least in academia's terms, than the letter that 150 of my fellow faculty members signed and published in the campus student newspaper during orientation week, in which they distanced themselves from the dean's take on things. Those of us who have signed this letter, they told the students, have a variety of opinions about requests for trigger warnings in safe spaces. We may also disagree as to whether free speech is ever legitimately interrupted by concrete pressures of the political. This is as it should be. But let there be no mistake. Such requests often touch on substantive, ongoing issues of bias, intolerance, and trauma that affect our intellectual exchanges. To start a conversation by declaring that such requests are not worth making is an affront to the basic principles of liberal education and participatory democracy, end quote. They went on to talk about how important it was for the work that we do in the classroom to be conducted in an atmosphere of mutual respect and to a commitment to learning, quote, from a wealth of histories and experiences, to more discussion, not less, to openness, not closure, end quote. After which they offered a brief history of the history of safe spaces in, quote, gay, civil rights, and feminist efforts of the mid-20th century to create places protected from quite real forces of violence and intimidation, end quote. It would be naive, they acknowledged or insisted, quote, to think that the University of Chicago is immune from social problems. It's very hard for me to read this straight, trust me. Yet the administration, and the footnote here is, they're talking, the dean of students who wrote the letter that went out and everybody heard about is an administrative dean. But what he wrote was, in fact, a cover letter for a little booklet that our college dean, John Boyer, sent out to our students. And John is a member of my department, right? So the administration is multi-layered in this argument, my colleagues. Yet the administration confusingly disconnects safe spaces it supports, see the list of mentoring services on the college's own website, from intellectual safe spaces that it does not, as if issues of power and vulnerability stop at the classroom door, end quote. I did not sign this letter. Not because I think my colleagues did anything inappropriate as such in publishing it, quite the reverse. They would not be University of Chicago faculty if they did not get up in arms about something the administration says at least twice a decade. That, as our very own Dean Boyer chronicled at length in his comprehensive history of the college, it's fat, is what we at Chicago do, fight with the administration. But likewise, we argue with ourselves, sometimes at length, not always as openly as perhaps we should. I was happy back in September 2016 when I saw the post streaming on my Facebook feed about Dean Ellison's letter. I was afraid when I saw the email sent to my department letting me know about the faculty's letter and inviting me to sign. I was even more afraid when I read the names on the list of those who approved the faculty letter, among them colleagues in my own field of medieval studies, many of them colleagues in my own department of history. What would they think of me if I didn't sign? I spent some time preparing for this talk scrolling through the list of names again. It's still up there, right? It's still there. My heart sinks just a little bit when I see the name of someone I respect. I breathe easier when there is a name missing. What if, I asked myself when I first saw the letter, I just pretended I was too engrossed in my research to have known about it? I was on leave that quarter and the next, not attending faculty meetings or functions on campus. Nobody would ever know that I had seen the letter and refused, not just neglected, but refused to sign. If I was this frightened at the thought of disagreeing with my colleagues, me, a tenured faculty member, think how our students must have felt if they agreed with the deans and disagreed with their teachers on issues of power and vulnerability and what should be done about them. Yes, we're talking political correctness here, even at the University of Chicago. Seriously, my colleagues think that the administration is creating a hostile environment for our students by telling them that they should expect to be challenged and made uncomfortable over the course of their studies. I'm doing this from script so that I don't keep you here all evening, right? Well, that depends on what we think a university is for, as I've learned since that fateful September, when I found myself embroiled in the culture wars in ways I never could have expected, in large parts thanks to the commentary that I've made about my experiences on my blog, Fencing Bear at Prayer. Here's my accomplice. I have cards, please read. So that's the front. You can see I'm still doing it, right? That's the most recent one. That's on the bombing in Sri Lanka. I wrote about the dean's letter on September 29th, 2016, but only because this is what I do at the University of Chicago, which is create mischief and quarrel with my colleagues, only after spending a week watching videos of the talks that Milo Yiannopoulos had been giving the previous spring on his Dangerous Faggot tour. Am I allowed to say that? I was, which, his name or the name of the tour? I was curious about what kinds of speech my colleagues claimed our students would find so triggering. And Milo was making a point of being as triggering as possible. At the end of the week, I wrote to him, telling him how much I admired the work he was doing and how he had inspired me to start taking up some of the difficult issues we were facing in academia on my blog, starting with the trigger warnings that my colleagues at Chicago were so eager to defend. I would be more than happy to talk about Milo. No, you want me to keep going? Okay, fine. Q&A, that was always his best moments, right, when people are asking questions. So keep your questions. What I want to do now is tell you what I learned about the students from watching his talks. So there's a pop quiz here. Anybody know who that is? Yes, you know. I would not want to be this young woman. Back in September 2016, 5 months after the event she attended at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, featuring a discussion with Christina Hoff Sommers, Stephen Crowder, and Milo on the problems besetting university campuses with speech considered triggering, she became a favorite meme among those who see such concerns as at best mildly hysterical, at worst a symptom of the total breakdown of our national character, I paraphrase. Audiences at several of Milo's talks made reference to her, imitating her arm gestures and laughing at her expense. Milo, to his credit, admonished them, "No, we love Trigglypuff. Trigglypuff is wonderful," while insisting that it is not she, but those who have lied to her about what will make her happy who are to blame. "She is going to be miserable," he would say. Again, I paraphrase, but he does say this, "because feminists have taught her to believe that she can be fat without consequence," pointing especially in his talk at Louisiana State University to the health effects of obesity. While as longtime readers of Fencing Bear will know, I've had my own struggles with fat shaming. There's a whole thread there, go back. I think Milo makes a good point. It is possible to take body positivity too far the other way. Just as it is possible to be too thin, it is also possible to be too fat. We risk young and old women's lives, suggesting that fitness and size have no effects on their ability to be happy. But when I looked at the full video from which the GIF was generated, I saw something other than just a young woman who needs to lose weight. I saw a young woman who needs training, not only in formal methods of debate, for example, wait for the question and answer period to raise your concerns. She was actually protesting Christina Hoff Sommers, not Milo, which is interesting, right? And doing this in the middle of Christina's talk. But even more fundamentally, in schooling her soul. As Fencing Bear, I ventured to offer her a few tips, which I would like to share with you now. Think of them as antidotes to trigger warnings, what we ought to be telling our students instead of surrounding them with cotton wool and therapy puppies and things like that. First, consider the falcon. This was a meditation that first came to me as I was thinking about my weight and my responses to eating, how hard it seemed to sit with the feelings that constantly threatened to overwhelm me, and which, as I learned reading Janine Roth, I would stifle with food. Milo likes to say, how censored am I? Fuck your feelings. Whenever anyone tries to use his or her sense of being offended to try to shut down debate, Janine Roth more gently would say, practice sitting with them. Practice sitting with all of the anxieties and doubts that feel like they are going to overwhelm you. Practice feeling your feelings, letting them simply be there, not trying to make them go away, not trying to fight them, just feeling them. Sit with them long enough to realize that they are only feelings. They cannot hurt you, however overwhelming they may seem. This applies to feelings that you have about yourself, when you are alone and wishing you could be with your friends, when you are struggling with your schoolwork, more on this in a moment, and your demon is telling you how stupid you are. I've never heard that one. Oh, sorry. Shush. When you're listening to someone speak and he or she says something you aren't sure about, particularly when it conflicts with things you've previously been taught for years by your teachers, parents, or friends. Sit with your feelings. Let them wash over you. Feel them in their full force. And then over time realize that they aren't scary anymore. They're just feelings. Second, develop a skill. Here, your falcon training will serve you well, because one of the greatest barriers, as Fencing Bear knows all too well, to developing a skill is, you guessed it, your feelings. Feelings of envy and pride, feelings of should, feelings of frustration and anger and doubt and impatience, feelings of all the time someone, maybe your father or your mother, your sister, your uncle, suggested that you didn't have the talent for this or that art. Feelings of the shame that have washed over you whenever your mother told you not to show off. Feelings of wishing you were anyone other than who you are. Again, they're just feelings. They can make you miserable, but they cannot make you happy. What can? As Chicago psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi argued, skill. More particularly, skill exercised under the appropriate conditions of difficulty such that you are neither anxious or bored. And that's the skill level increases, the challenge level increases, and you need to end up in that magic slice, right? That's the balance between anxiety and boredom. Flow, he calls it, as if it's easy, which it is, but only in concept, almost never in execution. I, Fencing Bear, am living proof that's in the blog. Why? Because real happiness comes not from doing things that we find easy, or worse, from following our passion, but from confronting challenges and rising to them. Here, competition is our friend because it gives us opportunities in which to exercise our skills, but even more importantly, because it provides real opportunities for failure. We learn nothing when we win, except that our skills were adequate to the task. We learn and learn big. If we having learned to sit with our feelings, we can ignore them and pay attention to what we need to change in our practice. This, to my mind, as both Fencing Bear and professor of history, is the real scandal afflicting our university and college campuses today. Not that the students are feeling triggered by the feelings they experience when confronting ideas or assignments that they do not know how to address, but that we, their teachers, have failed to give them proper challenges because we, and I don't really include myself in this group, but as a teacher, I always have room to improve, so yes, I have to. Because we have become so obsessed with making sure they never feel bad. Well, to coin a phrase, fuck your feelings. Fuck our discomfort, teachers, when we ask our students a question and they don't know the answer. Fuck our anxieties about whether we are implicitly biased when we respond to them. Of course we are. As the Avenue Q puppets, you know the Avenue Q puppets? Everyone's a little bit racist. Fuck our feelings when we grade their assignments and feel sorry for them because in all honesty, we cannot give them an A, no matter how hard we know they tried. Fuck our feelings because if we don't, we're lying to them. That is far worse than making them feel a little bad. Why? Because as teachers, it is our job to give them accurate and honest feedback about the work they are doing, the thoughts and opinions they express, their grammatical and arithmetical skills, their comprehension of the material that we have assigned them, and their ability to work with it. If, as Milo likes to say, feminism is cancer, grade inflation is heart disease, diabetes, and suicide rolled into one. And not just the kind of grade inflation that everyone talks about when all the students at Harvard get A's. The kind that sucks at your soul because you have never been presented with an actual challenge and so have no idea whatsoever to do with a novel and difficult task or idea. Political correctness is a symptom, not a cause. It's a symptom of putting students in situations, for whatever well-meaning reason we might give, for which they do not have the skills because they've never been given accurate feedback about how they performed. Of course, they're triggered when they encounter professors like Christina Hoff Sommers suggesting that maybe all college-aged men are not rapists, or that equality of opportunity is different from equality of outcome. If every time that they've been presented with something that made them feel mildly uncomfortable, for example, like losing a fencing battle, they have been told that what mattered was their feelings rather than that they learned what they needed to do to improve either their understanding of what the speaker has said or their ability to provide an appropriate answer. This is one of the key elements, as Csikszentmihalyi has shown, of experiencing flow. Immediate and unambiguous feedback combined with clarity of goals and a concentration on the task at hand, so that one learns from the practice and thus can grow in skill. This is the mistake that I believe my colleagues in academia have been making, including all of those on my campus who signed the faculty letter against our deans. College is not meant to be therapy. It's more like a monastery, or it should be. Wouldn't everybody be better able to study if we were all segregated by sex and expected to be celibate? No, a schola for training the soul. Training the soul is terrifying work. That's why, the Benedictine tradition, you need a school in the first place. Here, if you'll pardon me, I will need to let my medievalist roots show a bit. This is the way Benedict of Nursia described the purpose of the monastery in the prologue to his Little Rule for Beginners, on which the Benedictine monastic tradition was based. Quote, "And so we are going to establish a school for the service of the Lord. In founding it, we hope to introduce nothing harsh or burdensome, but if a certain strictness results from the dictates of equity for the amendment of vices or the preservation of charity, do not be at once dismayed and fly from the way of salvation, whose entrance cannot but be narrow. For as we advance in the religious life and in faith, our hearts expand and we run the way of God's commandments with unspeakable sweetness of love. Thus, never departing from his school, but persevering in the monastery according to his teaching until death, we may, by patience, share in the sufferings of Christ and deserve to have a share also in his kingdom." End quote. But you will say, colleges and universities aren't monasteries. They're institutions of higher learning, not communities of prayer. To which I would respond, but they are. Where do you think all that higher learning comes from? Here is where I think we as professors have done our students a terrible disservice in preparing them for what it means to engage in the kind of learning that we do or ought to be doing on our university campuses. To judge from the outrage triggered by Milo's campus talks on the importance of diversity of thought and free speech, our students come to campus woefully ill-prepared to encounter arguments that run counter to the things that others in our ongoing national conversations about race and gender have said. In part, this is because their teachers themselves do not know the counter-arguments, at least to judge from the responses that I get from my colleagues over my blogging about Milo, never mind taking the time to find out what such a dangerous speaker actually says. And just if you're not fans of Milo yet, you will be. If you haven't guessed yet, it's not what you read in the mainstream media. As I told Dean Boyer when I wrote to thank him for the book that he sent the students about academic freedom, maybe it's because I'm a medievalist, but I do dislike people being labeled as heretics without a proper inquisition. Plus, I'm a medievalist. More or less daily, I am wrestling with the way in which the history of Europe has been distorted by, as my colleagues would put it, concrete pressures of the political. Don't even get me started on Marx. But the problem, I think, goes deeper than this, which is why our students are feeling so anxious and, yes, triggered by some of the things that we ask them to read, talk, and think about in our classrooms and lecture halls. Bluntly, we aren't teaching them. Okay, again, not me, at least, oh well, never mind. I'm trying to be inclusive here. Sure, we assign them reading to do and problem sets to solve. We ask them questions in our discussion sections. We critique their writing and supervise their research. But these are just exercises, like standing and singing the Psalms over and over for the whole of one's life, as Benedict's monks did. Here is one way to visualize the problem. And this was actually given to me by one of my fencing friends who does business consulting, and it's from Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. So this is a method of thinking about how you are conceptualizing, pitching your own work. But it's also, as I've come to it, it was very helpful in the thinking about what's at stake in the different levels of training that we are, in fact, introducing our students to. Most of what we teach our students is only the what, the outer ring of intellectual labor. The things that we do as scholars, whether writing papers, conducting experiments, giving talks to our colleagues, and so forth. Arguably, for most of us, this is the only level at which we engage with our students' encounter with the materials of our respective fields. We assign them things to read or problems to work, and then test them on their ability to manipulate similar materials according to the models we have given them. And this, I think, by the by, is why we have so much scholarship that simply takes the dominant modes of interpretation, by now in the humanities and social sciences, almost exclusively race and gender, yes, even at the University of Chicago, and applies them over and over again, right? We are stuck at the what, right? So content, as it were. Content matters, but the what that we study is that outer ring. Occasionally, although even at Chicago, less and less so than we used to, I think, we force ourselves to engage with the how, training our students not just to practice manipulating texts or data according to the models we've given them, but getting them to look at intellectual labor. And here I'm using the term in its monastic sense, the labora of the cloister and scriptorium, as opposed to the ora of the choir, the work of the cloister as opposed to the prayer of the choir. Getting them to look at intellectual labor as itself a kind of practice that makes certain kinds of demands, above all on the imagination, but also on the ego, as anyone who has ever faced the terrors of writer's block knows. Almost never, and I do mean never, do we ask the question at the center of Sinek's golden circle, the why of what we do, whether as teachers or scholars. This, I would argue, is what is most triggering to our students. Why? Because the why question is not something you can answer in terms of skills or employability or credentials or any of the other external measures by which we gauge our effectiveness as teachers and our students' ability to learn. Why should students spend tens of thousands of dollars being tested in particular subjects so as to gain the credential of a BA? Nobody, at least nobody in my nearly 30 years in academia, ever asks. Why? Because asking this question requires us to do far more than perform well on a test or get an article accepted through peer review. That's the professor's equivalent of the midterm, right? Because asking this question opens us up and lays us bare to God. Another great English Catholic, just like Milo, J.R.R. Tolkien, as always, put it best. Spoiler, I don't think the new movie tells you this part. Towards the end of his life, Tolkien received a letter from Camilla Unwin, the daughter of his publisher, asking him for help with a school project on the theme, "What is the purpose of life?" Tolkien responded, late as always, "What does the question really mean?" Such questions, he argued, are, quote, only really useful when they refer to the conscious purposes or objects of human beings or to the uses of things they design and make, end quote. The value of all other things, those things not designed and made by human beings, like the natural world, right? Everybody else, lies not in their utility to people, but in themselves. Quote, they would exist even if we did not. But since we do exist, one of their functions is to be contemplated by us, end quote. And given that we are human, that is curious, we are prone in our contemplation of things other than ourselves to ask the question how they came to have the patterns and structures that they do, which then brings us to the question why all other such things exist. Quote, but why, in this sense, implying reasons and motives, can refer only to a mind. Only a mind can have purposes in any way or degree akin to human purposes, still Tolkien, which brings us to the question, quote, is there a God, a creator, designer, a mind to which our minds are akin, being derived from it, so that it is intelligible to us in part? With that, we come to religion and the moral ideas that proceed from it, end quote. Without belief in such a personal God and his creator, right? Tolkien was above all an artist, right? So his primary referent for God is artist, right? Without belief in such a personal God, Tolkien contends, the question, what is the purpose of life, is unaskable and unanswerable. To whom or what would you address the question? What's the purpose of life? Who are you asking, right? But since, he continues, there are things in the universe who have developed with minds, us, to ask such questions, it is likely that if the universe were to reply, it would say something like this. Universe, I am as I am. There is nothing you can do about it. You may go on trying to find out what I am, but you will never succeed. And why you want to know, I do not know. Perhaps the desire to know for the mere sake of knowledge is related to the prayers that some of you address to what you call God. At their highest, these seem simply to praise him for being as he is and for making what he has made as he has made it, end quote. This, for Tolkien, was the purpose of life, the only purpose life could conceivably have, given that purpose implies by definition being made. So he says, so it may be said that the chief purpose of life is to increase according to our capacity our knowledge of God by all the means we have, and to be moved by it to praise and thanks, to do as we say in the Gloria in Excelsis, Laudamus te, benedicamus te, adoramus te, glorificamus te, gratias agamus tibi propter magdum gloriam tuum. We praise you, we call you holy, we worship you, we proclaim your glory, we thank you for the greatness of your splendor. And in moments of exaltation, we may call on all created things to join in our chorus, speaking on their behalf, as is done in Psalm 148 and in the Song of the Three Children in Daniel, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, all mountains and hills, all orchards and forests, all things that creep and birds on the wing. End quote. Such praises, I am sure you are unsurprised to hear, have little to no place in the modern university. But I would argue our students sense them nevertheless. They come to us hungry for meaning, hungry for understanding, hungry for some sense of what it all means. And we feed them scraps, the leavings of centuries upon centuries of human inquiry into the workings of our souls and the universe as creatures of God, disconnected from the why that originally gave those studies their purpose. Because, of course, for most of the centuries of the existence of universities, and before them monasteries, the whole point of academic inquiry was to prepare for the encounter with God in the choir. The labora was never intended as an end in itself. Rather, it was the discipline which the monks and scholars practiced so as to be able to endure the great mystery of the choir, the encounter with the Creator of heaven and earth in all his inspiring love, awe-inspiring love. This was the reason that Benedict provided the rule that he did, with all of its recommendations for how the monks should schedule their labors and prayers. Such encounters with the sacred are terrifying, difficult for mere mortals to withstand without going mad. Our students are going mad. We've brought them into a place where we systematically expose them to the terrors of existence, its beauty and tragedy, its greatness and profundity, and we give them no training in how to prepare themselves for this encounter, in large part because we, as teachers, have no training ourselves. How does one train for the encounter with God? Perhaps we might start by acknowledging that we should, unless that is, we want to see it all burn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will say I was a little bit offended by the use of the F word, feelings. That was, yeah, the other one was completely fine. We are going to take some questions here. We won't do a trigger warning, but I will share with you very briefly before the Q&A. There was a great post on the website Everyday Feminism, which I know you all frequent, that was giving a trigger warning to an article, but it also gave a trigger warning to the trigger warning, because it said that trigger was offensive because it conjures up violent imagery. So they had the content warning to warn you of the word trigger, to warn you the green grass grew all around. So thank you for what you do to break through this nonsense. We're going to take some questions. Because we have a large group of people here in limited time, make sure your first sentence ends with a question mark and your second sentence doesn't exist. For those who violate the rule, fencing bear is authorized to stab on sight. So with that...
She's well trained, come on.
Yeah, I know, I very much so. So be careful, if not for me, for fencing bear. Who's got first question for the EJ? Yes, Professor Maida.
Could you tell us more about Milo, please?
And there goes the night, all right.
Well, okay, no, it needs to be a little more specific than that, because, okay, so on the blog, I've showed you...
Anything.
Anything. That's when he came to Chicago summer before last, and we did the little video at DePaul where he's pretending to put Dangerous into the library. And that it was when Dangerous was obviously being advertised. So we had to get on the elevated train and look for one of the posters, and then everybody jump off and stand in front of it. So there's an occasion behind that poster pose. That one is a special event that some of my friends had last summer. He is the Lord Poseidon, and I am Lady Wisdom. If you want to know that story, the Milo Chronicles have all of the posts about my adventures with him.
Yes, Eva.
Yeah.
To follow on from that, how do you think Milo's permanent banning from Facebook is going to affect what he's able to do?
Well, so everybody sign up for his email list if you want to follow him. I mean, this is clearly so I was showing you my final tweet, right? That's my one and only actually like viral tweet after the Notre Dame fire. We are not going to be able to stay on these platforms indefinitely. That's clear that that's going to happen. And I mean, I've been thinking about that over the last day, right? Because obviously I'm front and center in a lot of this. I've changed my profile picture to his right now. So on my Facebook saying, okay, Mark, you don't want to see Milo anymore, too bad. But the story of this fire and the story of the monasteries is one that really should give us hope. Rebuild. Right? The roof caught fire, and I did a couple of pieces, one in First Things and one in the Catholic Herald, about my response to the fire, which was there was a reason that the building was originally built. It was built for the praises of Mary and singing the Psalms in praise of God, and the function of the building matters, right? If it burns down, and you're not using it for its original purpose, so what? It's a pile of rocks, right? Renew our faith, renew our sense of why we're doing what, that's the why, right? It's like, that's what my point was. We need to renew our why, and then we will be able to build the things that we need to do. Now, what Milo is trying to do right now, he has his own site, dangerous.com, and he's working on a new show that he's been doing the pilots and skits on it and such. Right now he's going to rely on being able to send out notices by email, right? Because Zuckerberg took him off Facebook. But we can rebuild, right? We can find other ways as long as we still have the sense of there's actually a joy to the things that we're trying to argue. And I think this is a terrible danger for everybody. If conservatives get black-pilled, as we say, if we lose our morale, you might as well give up, right? It's a pile of rocks that just burned down. If you remember that it's for the joy and the gratitude that we have for being given the life that we have and the opportunities that we do and the creativity and ability that we do, then I think that's the better response. And that's what I was trying to suggest 3 years ago in these meditations on what Milo was showing me even then. So that's our mission.
You mentioned that the political correctness phenomenon is a symptom rather than a cause. And I'm wondering if you think that the same applies to these social media companies, that they're not the causes, they're symptoms of cultural attitudes that are pushing for what they're doing.
Yes, I think they're certainly symptoms, right? And my big, large-scale project in my work right now is this training of virtue, right? The idea of how we train our souls. And that Falcon meditation, I was sincere that was my Milo fat shamed me, and I started working out and stuff. That learning all of your vices and your addictions and the ways in which you react with your feelings. The bear she's battered, and she used to be more white than she is now. She's kind of gray because she's been with me for 15 years. Learning how you in competition and therefore you under stress, therefore you being challenged, respond. That's what I see. The political correctness stuff is people that they have only one register of response. They can't have arguments. They don't know how. They don't even know how to calm themselves down enough to think through what they're perceiving as a threat, so they just scream, right? If you train yourself, you know when things are threats, you know when they aren't, you know how to respond, you practice all of that. And this is the seal of the University of Paris. From the 13th century, and the patroness of the University of Paris was the Virgin Mary. Right, she's the embodiment of the learning of the trivium, the arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Our universities are grounded on an institution that was designed for debate, right? Disputation, for arguing through difficult text. But the men that went to that university, they expected to be challenged and trained, right? They were knights. Abelard famously says that when he goes off to Paris to want to become a cleric and a scholar instead of a knight, he translated his sort of jousting into the classroom, right? But it takes that kind of sort of intellectual training to get out of that. And what I see on social media is basically a bunch of toddlers who don't know how to behave. They've never been disciplined to train their feelings and therefore be able to get to the level of intellectual work that they should be able to. That's
Yes.
probably going to get me in more trouble than anything else.
And the F words. All right, we've got one over there.
I'm a little kid. So what do you? I've been told a lot about rape culture. It's a little off topic. What do you think about rape culture? Like,
What, that it's non-existent?
no, like tell me, like for what exactly what you think about it, like a little bit in depth.
Okay.
Because I didn't.
That Andrew said, I have had many. The Milo story is a very, very long one, but my story began before him with a post that I did on Fencing Bear in June 2015 that was entitled "Talking Points: 3 Cheers for White Men." There's a piece in the New York Times this weekend that's going to give you a little bit more of that story. And my first cheer was for chivalry. Right? The second was consensual marriage. The third was women's right to vote. Chivalry is the answer, right? That there should be a culture of appropriate relation between the sexes. That women should have respect for men, and men should, do valiant quests to win their love. But that there is what we've lost, and this is Janice knows, right? It's like we agree on this. That the feminists that we've been arguing with for the past 20, 30 years have no sense of that appropriate relationship between the sexes, right? They don't know how to either suggest to women to behave well, which we don't always. There's a post on my blog I think you'd like about why women need the Virgin Mary. I'm just going to be, all my bad words are going to come out because we're bitches, right? What? Because women need training in virtue too, right? Women need training in restraining ourselves against the very kinds of internal female fighting that we get up to, and in the way in which we mistreat men, and vice versa, right? I did a whole series of posts after my colleagues called me both a white supremacist and a misogynist for those 3 cheers. That if you want to know the complicated understanding of those relations between the sexes in the Western tradition, go to Fencing Bear, the medieval gate at the beginning, the 3 cheers for white men. I have a whole sort of meditation on what it means to be American, what it means to be the colonial Scots-Irish, who brought a lot of their ideals with them to the early colonies, to the medieval understanding, to the Vikings and Crusaders, to what it means for me, having my dad being a veteran of the Vietnam War and a surgeon who served in that war, and the way he dealt for the rest of his life with the people that he was taking care of. That we have made a caricature of the relationship between the sexes, and it's hurting everybody.
You're a professor of history, and obviously your chapter of history that you focus on is hundreds of years before what I'm about to ask about. But in the US, you've got Confederate statues being taken down. In Canada, we've got something that is, I'd say, even more egregious, which is our first prime minister being rewritten as the greatest villain in Canadian history, John A. Macdonald. And I'm wondering, as a scholar of history, if you have any advice for how we can push back against this, because we're losing. I mean, quite frankly, we're losing this.
The battle has to be fought by historians, right? That's what we do. It's also one that we actually can see happening over and over again in history. Any of you have heard of the Carolingians? Charlemagne? They rewrote the history of the Merovingians. How many of you believe that? Okay, maybe you don't know them. Right? The Merovingians is the do-nothing kings, right? And Charlemagne's line was appropriate to take over from that family because, in fact, they weren't really ruling. It was the mayors of the palace. The Norman historians do it to the Anglo-Saxons. The Tudors do it to the 15th century, right? What you're seeing is what history does, right? Which is the rewriting. Oh, there's Mary fighting demons. The rewriting of the past to fit a more recent. If you want, Shakespeare is rewriting the entire late medieval story of the kings, right? So that Richard III is the great villain of the Shakespearean plays is, of course, because the family that Shakespeare is living under needs him to be, right? So to a certain extent, understand that what we're living through is one of those efforts, right? To rewrite the previous period they're typically caricatured, right? If you think of the way Richard III is portrayed in the play, right? That they're caricatures, they're simplifications, but they're very hard to fight, right? And I say answering your question, the only way to fight absolutely only way we can fight effectively is with joy, right? We cannot fight with bitterness or anger or, they're busy making new myths, right? So we need better myths. We need myths of valor and courage and cheerfulness and joy. And that's the way we'll beat their stories, not with trying to correct the narrative.
So we need Trigglypuff, is what you're saying. Valor, joy, lots of that contained in there.
Memes! These are medieval memes, right? There's Mary fighting the devil and the soul. She's doing it on the behalf of the soul, right? And here she is as physician. She's healing a woodchopper who's chopped his leg off. So we need the joy of and Milo and I have been talking about a lot about this. You'll have heard him, if you've watched any of his more recent videos, talking about this. The joy of the Middle Ages is recognizing, here's the prayer, this is the Magnificat, and the kind of whimsy that you see in these prayer books is, I think, part of the prayer, right? It's this recognition of the playfulness and joy is the only word I have for it, so I just have to keep saying that. The joy of understanding who we are as creatures of God. And I think that's the only way we win. I don't think we win it by telling them that they're mistelling history, because they don't care.
What about the atheists? We don't have this purpose.
Give me time.
Is there anything that you can say to help us? Are we? I mean, not to convert us, but
no, it's a serious question.
As non-believers within universities, are we unable to find the things that you think academics need to find?
I think I see things you don't.
I think you see things that aren't there, but that's...
Okay, and that's the test, right? I say Christians have not been very good at being able to do our own apologetics, right? And what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow is the academy good for the soul, right? And I'm going to set up some more of this argument. But that got me into trouble because I wrote a piece for the Divinity School newsletter about Milo and the effect on college campuses of his talks. And I've seen, if we can't talk about these deep, like metaphysical questions in the university, practicing them at the level that they were in the original sort of institutional history, it's just going to spill out into the streets with people yelling at each other, right? So, what my fantasy, like and then my colleagues in the Divinity School wrote another letter against me, saying she's hateful, and I'm like, what did I say? Theology matters, right? I'm sorry, it keeps going off. It's precisely at that level that we don't have practice talking, right? And I think there's a long story that's sort of summarized in that Sightings article about why the universities gave up on it. But I think in giving up on it, we have surrendered the why, and so it's rippling down into the anxiety that people experience.
Oh, we got lots of questions. Well, why didn't you start earlier with that, Mark? Let's start with the woman in the orange scarf.
With Natalie?
Yes. Okay. If that's Natalie, yes.
It is. Hi.
Hi.
In practical terms, what would you advise universities to do to make students feel the joy of learning? What are we doing wrong? What can we do better?
I think so. Everybody should be doing sports. I mean, I think there is something. No, but not necessarily at the not professional paid. It's training at the physical, spiritual, and mental level, right? And I think some of it is being able to confront yourself in your awkwardness in different skill sets. So if not athletics, music, or art or something like I do a lot of in a number of my classes. I do a course on Tolkien, right? And in order to emphasize the sort of seriousness of the creativity behind his stories, I give the students an option to do a project at the end that is a creative project in different media, depends on what they want to do, and sort of making them realize that this sort of training is happening at a lot of different levels and in a lot of different directions for them. But the other that I think we do well at Chicago is actual, like, specific understanding of what it takes to write. For example, we have a very good program that used to be called the Little Red Schoolhouse. It's now called our writing program. That is, well, it was started by Joseph Williams, who was the greatest craftsman of style I've ever come across, better than Strunk and White, has nothing to do with it, and better than Orwell. No, he's better. He's truly better because he breaks down the problem of effective prose very, very systematically and very well. And I think maybe I don't have quite the problems that everybody else is having around the country with students, because we at least have trained ourselves to understand how to help them with their particular kind of academic problems. So I think that's two different lines of thing. We should be better at training in the actual skills of the how that we're working with, and we should also be appreciative that there is a range of skills that we're trying to get people to be spiritually and mentally effective in. How do we do that? I mean, we have to change our culture, but I think we have to change our teaching culture to get away from, and this I don't know how to do because this is truly above my pay grade, but that's the problem. How do we change it from a credentialing institution to back to a school? Right. And I remember doing a paper back when I was in college in the 80s in religious ethics, and I was already upset with the credentialing problem then, and I clearly am now too. Right. I'm saying that we are robbing our students, placing them in horrific debt sometimes, and giving them nothing but status. And we were talking about that at dinner, right? It's like that when you've transformed your institution into something that it's at odds with its purported purpose, you're in trouble.
Hands up, Andrew will make a mental map.
Yeah, the next in the queue was Professor McNally.
Thank you, Joan of Arc, for coming here. And I want to shout out to Strunk and White, and we're going to have to talk about this later.
On guard.
So Barbara Kay had a wonderful piece in today's Post about how the public education system isn't training kids how to write. And we're seeing that in the Ontario universities. Just this week, we shut down a premium program in the business school at Laurier that was because students can't write. We were asking them to write really big reports, and they can't write sentences.
Yep.
And so that goes back to the trivium. Mm-hmm. We have abandoned the trivium, which is the medieval university's foundation. Mm-hmm. But getting back to, and so I think that's a big problem about the level of discourse and why students prefer protest on campus. But getting back to the why, I'm a Christian, so I get it. But we're secular.
Explain to him.
Yeah. But I want to help him out.
Right, exactly. Yes. Yes.
So I think that Jordan B. Peterson is giving the atheists kind of an angle to explain a why.
Get to the question, Mark Will.
Oh, that was it. I want to set her up. So I'm just trying to set Rachel up on the Jordan B. Peterson idea as an alternative to a religious foundation for the why.
Yeah.
Your comments, please.
There's another page on the blog called The Lady and the Logos. I have some quarrels with Jordan, theologically, which I've written about, and also great admiration for how he raised the question of the symbolic, right? And I think if you want my full version of that, I did two videos with Jonathan Pajot, where we talked about the symbolic level of things. I've also done 2 videos with Three Craters Symposium where I talked about some of my concerns. I'd rather leave it there and not touch that right now. But it's the thing about his work is he clearly tapped exactly the nerve that people were needing pointed to, right? And I think now. What do we do with that realization? That's important.
We'll go to Bruce. Bruce next.
Okay.
The savior of Ontario law. Go ahead, sir.
Hardly.
Co-savior.
Will you tell us a bit more about the moment you were describing of feeling badly about not signing the letter? Because it struck me as incongruent. I mean, I find this with my own colleagues sometimes, but the idea of a scholar with tenure whose business it is to debate and disagree, why is there an emotional reluctance not to belong to the group. I would have thought we would all want to be contrarians.
So, well, I mean, they're signing the letter to protest against the deans, right? And I'm not wanting to sign it because I agree with the deans, right? So I see that they're all disagreeing with the deans, and my thought is, what will they think if I don't agree with them, right? And I think that social pressure is enormous. Some of the other things.
That's my question.
Why?
Why do you feel enormous pressure?
Well, clearly I don't feel sufficient pressure because I certainly haven't signed that. I mean, the opposite is, there's a post on the blog called something, it was like a Christmas thing, it was meditation on the making of lists, and the ways in which those lists are going around, and everybody signs them because they're all outraged. I got one with 1,500 signatures saying that I was a white supremacist. Yeah. That was a longer story, there's more to that. And it was very interesting how that went around like lightning around the emails over about 3 days, right, before they got enough signatures to send it to my dean saying you should censor her, right? Friends of mine signed that letter, and I confronted them later at conferences pretending not to have seen the signatures, because now they'll know if they watch this. Because I wanted to give them a chance to say, why did you believe that about me? I never said any of those things. Where did you get that? And the sort of panic that people are clearly feeling if they don't stand up and put their names on those things is very, very interesting. We are creatures in academia of peer review. Of course, you're always trying to figure out what the peer group thinks. And I'd say either I'm not good at playing with my peers. I'm better at parental figures than maybe I am with siblings, and I'm very good with children, right? The people that are younger than I am. That maybe there's some of that, and I would like someone to do a proper study of exactly how all of these kind of pressures are playing out in academia, because I think they're generational tensions. Obviously, and some of us feel them one way, and one of my colleagues, I was talking about my dad, and she said, "You're just a good daughter, aren't you?" And I'm like, right. Some people are clearly more drawn to the peer group than the cross-generational approval. What else am I thinking? So this is okay. You brought up Dr. Peterson, and I'll just have to talk about it. I can talk about Milo too. The thing that he said, that zebra story is always very telling, right? The one where, the zebras, once you mark them, they stand out from the herd, and you don't want to stand out from the herd. Academics all understand that, right? You really don't want to stand out from the herd. You think you do. You think you want to be, sort of on the top of your field and things like that, but all that happens is the lions eat you. So his animal stories are often some of his strongest examples. That speaks to that concern about what do I do when I step out of the group, and academia is institutions have that strength by working together as groups, but they're also what's the word, susceptible to corruption because of it.
The gentleman in the blue shirt here was next. Yes, you.
Well, so I guess it was very closely related to this question. How do you? Because you mentioned that that you were sort of standing out contrary. You had a lot of contrary opinions to people in your department, and I was just wondering, what do you do in a lounge, for example? Do you have really loud discussions and?
I'll do what Milo told me to do.
So
remember
really
to laugh, be cheerful, right? It's like, it really is important. Do not go into these situations ready to fight, right? You can't do that on the fencing strip. You go on angry or prideful or envious or any of those things. No, you go in joyfully. And that's why I'd say for, the religious question should be that way too, right? I think that people miss the reason that we are, we have the good stuff, right? We have the good things that we want to share. We have the beautiful literature. We have the beautiful art. We have the beautiful music. We have the beautiful ideas. We have things to share from, centuries of human creativity. Remember to laugh. Remember to enjoy it and not take it as I think that's where the trigger warnings are so dangerous as a premise, right? All of this stuff is so dangerous, we're not even allowed to talk about it.
So what do you do when you're the only one with an opinion and everybody else around you is opposite?
Smile.
Yes, we'll go one
It's
final.
worked so far.
Okay, well, I was going to say one final. Scrap the final. We'll go to this lovely lady in the, I don't even know what color that is, peach?
What I think you're saying is what I've heard from others on television and on my internet searches about combating hate with love.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just argue with someone who you know feels opposite from you, even if there's a whole group. To change things, you really need to come in with your attitude of being happy where you are and happy to engage in discussing with that person.
Yes. Yes, and so the lesson plan is a blog post called How to Be a Happy Warrior, which I wrote after the series on chivalry, right? It's in like February 2016. And as a fencer, the most important thing you understand is respect your opponent, right? And that's what I said. I mean, so all these colleagues have called me names for 3-4 years now, 3 years. They gave me the opportunity, right? They gave me a chance to train myself to become better in my arguments. I said 3 cheers for white men chivalry, and they were like, wow, what does she think? And I'm like, well, okay, I got to explain, don't I? Thank you, right? And fencing bout begins with a salute and it ends with a salute because you cannot fence by yourself. So yes.
We'll go next to Professor Fiamengo.
I was surprised in a way that you framed your argument in terms of the university as a credentialing place that has in a way lost its soul, because I'm sure you would agree with me also that one could think about what's going on in the culture war as an interreligious struggle, in that you're coming from a particular religious perspective, and those who are opposing you also are coming from a religious perspective, but it is the religion of social justice. It has its, and I would say actually that from my perspective, the what has been largely, I'd be happy if we could go back to the what.
Maybe we're not even in the circle anymore.
Yeah, and even if we just dealt with the what, but actually I feel that the what has been erased and it's all become about the why.
Okay.
But the why is the great, utopian world order that we want to bring into existence. It has its own doctrines, it has its own sacred texts, Marx and whatever ones in particular disciplines. It certainly has its heretics who must be, expunged, persecuted quite viciously. The only thing it lacks, really, it also has its own, joy and exhilaration and sense of commitment and sense of purpose. The only thing it lacks is a loving God who forgives. There is no forgiving God in the SJW religion. So I just wonder, that's not really a question, I guess, but could you comment a little bit on that aspect, on the religious dimension?
That's tomorrow's talk.
Okay. All right.
No, seriously, that is. It's exactly.
Okay.
Just one ahead of you.
So tonight was this sense of the training and that anxiety, the problem with feelings and the anxiety that not having proper training creates. Tomorrow, come back wherever we're going, right?
It's Somerville House. Come see me after the talk. I can give you the schedule.
The talk is academia good for the soul? And it's specifically that question of the theological problem.
Everything you've said is, I think everybody in the room agrees, it's brilliant and it's exhilarating. But
What, I triggered nobody? Oh dear.
I'm wondering,
Let me start again.
speaking about joy and speaking about a certain commitment to a higher good and the great sort of euphoria one feels in being privileged to be here and to be able even to engage with one's adversaries. When you walk into room 101, which is where I taught, that was actually the conference room, believe it or not, after Orwell. What do you do when you're attacked physically? Maybe you've never been attacked physically. What do you do about joy and and smiling and, showing that you somehow are committed to a higher truth or to a higher commitment or to a higher, to a higher good, when you can't smile anymore because you're bleeding, or when somebody beside you whom you admire and love or simply care for is also being attacked by these very same people whom you are meeting perhaps in the lounge. Perhaps there will be a free-for-all in the lounge. What would you do then? What happens to joy at that moment?
Then I'm happy that I'm trained as a warrior.
Good.
And
Good.
The fencing bearer is not just the training in emotions. It's training to be under threat, right? And the only threat that I get in tournaments is bruises, right? But I think maybe that's another thing that the students at Chicago seem to be good at. They have a lot of martial arts clubs. And I think, the woman, the Trigglypuff woman, she clearly can't do anything to help herself physically, right? She's screaming and yelling, right? But as a fencer, I see that's nothing, right? She could do that forever, right? That's no threat to there. You come at me, I'm going to be on guard, right? And I think it matters that we have our sort of physical understanding as well as that mental training. But happily, I have not been physically attacked. I think it makes sense to have some martial training. Yes, yes.
Yes.
I loved your warrior comment. It was very apropos, I think, for what I'm thinking and feeling these days. What I'm wondering about, in terms of the way the students responded to the Chicago principles when they were introduced, did you find that they were resistant or were they very open to them? Because I'm imagining, as a student many years ago and as someone who used to teach at the university, the resistance that you felt and the pressure, the implicit pressure, and maybe explicit pressure you felt to be a signatory on that letter that countered the Chicago principles. How then would the students feel if they were on board with that and they said, yes, we want to be challenged, we don't want to be coddled, we want to be intellectually rigorous, we want to be problem solvers, we want to make a difference in the world? How were those students treated and how did the students respond?
So technically the Chicago principles are a statement that was put out in 2014. And so it was curious to me that there was any, the faculty response that they had to the 2016 letter at all, right? But what that shows you is, in fact, at Chicago, we aren't, not everybody agrees with each other, right? And so we are, in fact, hopefully being the best model that we can for having a faculty that has different political opinions and so forth. However, for the most part, I don't meet that many other faculty that have different, my political opinions. So maybe 5, right, that have come to talk to me. Most of them are, as you would predict in academia in terms of their politics. But that being said, Chicago's culture is holding at the moment. It's still robust enough to be able to sustain having me there. And I can go into faculty meetings with it being normal, right? And that is as appropriate. The students, some of the students were obviously somewhat upset. I've had one piece of hate mail, actual hate mail, like it was tucked behind a Bulbasaur on my door. The Bulbasaur was always there. The note showed up and called me names. Janice actually tweeted it for me. And they took a police report about it, right? So that was, but that, direct confrontation, lots of letters in the student newspaper. There have been several of those over these past several years. Signatures, names, and stuff like that. It still matters. You go on campus and you smile, which means yes, it is a kind of discipline for me. I have to be on when I'm on campus, recognizing I need to be able to be prepared to respond to whatever happens. The students come and talk to me because they know I'm safe. And they're there, right? And of course, they're young men who are very grateful that, they'll be talking about their paper and then they'll just say afterwards, and they realize they're like gearing themselves up to be able to say something, thank you. And I'm like, good, right? I'm here for you. But I'm here for them as their teacher, and that's what has always been my commitment.
We've got one final question up here at the front.
Well, I'll just say something first, though.
Sure.
There are a lot of good campus novels. Stoner by John Williams touches on a few of the things that you've talked about today, the joy in scholarship. Do you know The Rebel Angels by
yes.
Robertson Davies?
I
Now,
love those.
scholars are
Robertson Davies
Rebel
is
Angels,
brilliant, yes.
according to Robertson Davies.
And while Mark's working his way up here, I will say, for those of you who aren't aware, those Chicago principles are, in fact, the law in Ontario right now. Ontario campuses have to have their own free speech commitments based on those very principles. Now, we don't know yet how well ingrained they are, but I think that was a very profound moment with the new Ontario government. So we thank anyone who was involved in putting those together. We'll finish out with Eva here.
But Bruce is going to talk about the tomorrow, so
Yeah.
come listen to Bruce.
And Bruce
on
is
that.
going to tell me it's not that great after all, but for now, let me ride high, Bruce.
Eva.
Thank you for giving me a second question. Picking up from what Janice said to you about she would be happy to see us go back to the what, because
I
the
agree,
social
yeah,
justice
yeah.
warriors do have their own religion, and they do. To what extent do you think that the trigger warnings, the social justice warrior misbehavior, and all of these kinds of things that are so prevalent on our campuses is due to the fact that there are an awfully large number of people who are not really qualified to be there, and they cannot cope with what the true function of a university is?
Yeah, I'm at Chicago, so there's and I've only been at Chicago in my teaching career, right? So so some of the things that have come at me over the last few years have startled me, right? Because I was naive enough to think everywhere was Chicago, and that this was just what academia was, right? So I don't probably have that much experience with.
Think about Yale, then.
Okay, I'll think about Yale then. All right, that's fair. That's fair. It still goes back to what I say about Trigglypuff. Who said Yale? Oh, okay. I just keep talking about the fencing bear. Because of fencing, I am regularly in large convention centers filled with teenagers who are competing, right? And I think one of the other things that tends to startle me about some of the things I see outside of my own immediate experience in terms of the way high schoolers are behaving or college students are behaving is I don't see it either with the fencers, because they know how to behave, right? They're disciplined. They have to train very, very hard to be competitors at the level that we compete. They are, for the most part, very polite, very gracious, very thoughtful. I get nothing but my students are amazing, right? Nothing that's happened to me in the last several years has changed a whit the gratitude I have for getting to teach where I do, because my students are fantastic, right? And when I'm talking about we're not taking care of them in the way that we should, I think that's the flip side. It's like the social justice argument is always taking care of them. It's like I know I have my maternal teacherly element too. It's like take care of them, get them to the level where they could be at a fencing tournament, lose, cry, and get back out on the strip and do it again, right? And that I see kids now who have that training and that discipline. I know it's available. I know it's out there in the culture, and why it's erupting in the way that it is in the incidents that we get in the media. What do those students not have that the ones that I know do, I think is my problem.
And I know we'll have time for lots more tomorrow, but a big thank you to Professor Rachel Fulton Brown for everything. Thank you.